Hello and welcome to Convin Conversations. I'm your host Ashish, CEO of Convin, a conversation intelligence platform for contact center setups. In today's episode of Convin Conversations, we have Morris Pentel with us. Morris is the founder of Customer Experience Foundation. He is also the CEO of eScore, an experienced designer and builder, emotions investigator, you can say. He is a writer, speaker, trainer, and many other roles with 40 years of experience in the contact center industry. He has seen it all from before the earliest days of cloud-based contractors to the latest innovation of the in the conversations. Welcome to Convin Conversations, Morris. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much, Ashish. It's an absolute a wonderful thing to be here today.
Sure. So in today's episode, Morris will be talking about customer sentiment analysis, right? And the ultimate deal breaker for any contact center CX. Before I go there, Morris, I always like to ask my guest to set the tone right. I have briefly introduced you, but I would love to hear from you about your journey. How did the career start off? And what kind of things you have encompassed in this long 40 years of journey.
Well, thanks for the question. So my journey started off at the beginning of the full call center era. And I was one of the first people in the United Kingdom to stand up in a room and say, let me tell you what a call center is. It's a room full of people making and receiving phone calls. And during the early days of the call center industry, it was a relatively simple and straightforward thing because all we were really trying to do was to route phone calls. And it got more sophisticated as time went by. We introduced things like scripting for agents and things that would pop up screens and make things happen. And I was lucky enough to be there at the beginning and to see all these things appear. And over my career, as well as being operational in a number of our large institutions, I've been privileged enough to design and to be involved in the design and delivery of a whole series of innovations. And today I'm working on conversationally sensitive chatbots that recognize customer emotions and deal with them in appropriate ways and help people to create new habits. And so when I think about my first job, in which I was taught how to actually sharpen a quill pen to do a map design, to working with the world's most advanced AI, I have to say I'm one of the world to have spent my career in this industry. And every day's a school day, and tomorrow I'm going to learn something new.
That's an amazing journey, right? Like just seeing everything from the pre-contact center era to probably seeing the newest of innovations, right? I mean, I can just imagine the kind of experience that you have. Yeah. So apart from that, right? Once, let's say you have been doing all of these activities in your entire career, right? Diving into today's topic, the whole customer service is an emotional transaction at its core, right? I mean, it is transactional, but it cannot be done without emotions at its core, right? Consumers may not always recall the details of their interaction, but they will always remember how the agent or the experience made them feel with you. So, and that can really have a very powerful impact. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I sort of agree with this. So a very famous consultant said to me once, when your mother cooks you dinner, it's a transaction. However, if you offer to pay her a £5 note for it, your mother will be offended for the rest of your life. And so what I think is that we talk about things as being transactional, and they are transactional, but there is no transactional without emotion. Now, sometimes the emotion is absent because of the nature of the transaction, and that is the right thing to do. And I'll give you a really good example of this. No one has ever been to a cash machine, a machine where you get money out, and gone, oh, this cash machine doesn't talk to me. We like the simplicity, we like the lack of emotional piece, but the second it goes wrong, the second that transactional technology fails, we are in a world of emotions. So it's really important that we understand that although some transactions don't necessarily have a clear emotional element to them, everything to do with human beings, and therefore everything to do with us, is emotional, even if the emotion switch in some transactions is off, because ideally we want to create them as habits. And what I mean by that is a transactional habit is rather like that journey home from somewhere where you're not even noticing what you're doing anymore, but you still get home in one piece safely because your mind is free and doing other things. So if I'm checking my bank balance once a month, as people do, I'm probably not even going to notice as long as everything's okay. But the second I see something that I'm unfamiliar with, suddenly my emotions switch in, suddenly I've got to pay attention. So what we want is, if you like, almost an emotion-free transaction, but we need to be able to react to emotion at a moment's notice. And I can give you a really, really good example of this. If I phone my bank and they keep me waiting, and I know this because I used to run customer experience at a bank, if they keep me waiting, I'm going to spend 5 minutes of the bank's money telling them about how long they kept me waiting. And that's going to mean that they're going to be 5 minutes later into the next call, and that person's going to tell me about the 10 minutes that they've wasted. I mean, one of the roles that I had, because there was some other publicity about the organization I was working for, suddenly people were queuing up. They were phoning to tell us how angry they were about the fact that we were doing a bad job. Then they started to complain about the amount of time that they were waiting in queues. Then people started to hang up, so the queues got even longer. And as a result of this, the cascading impact of the emotional, the emotional content, which is I'm unhappy with you, resulted in a cascading impact on all contact for that organization. Now, they saw it as transactional because it was only about people's bank balances, it was only about payments, but the emotional side of it took them out of their target SLAs for nearly a year and impacted millions on the bottom line.
Interesting.
Because you need a lot more agents. Emotions cost money.
Yes, exactly. And I was just thinking when you were saying, telling me all of this, right? It's a very interesting perspective to look at this, that if you're not able to look into or judge the emotions, right, how eventually it is turning out to be costing you the money as a business, right? And whatever you're trying to optimize for, it's essentially costing you the money if you're not looking at customer emotions. Just to get into a bit depth of it, right? It's very hard to set up that context for every contact centers, right? So like imagine there are all kinds of people running contact centers in very, very different ways. How do you set up this context to them? How do you give this idea to them and help them understand that, hey, look, if you're not going to understand sentiment analysis or the customer sentiment in detail or emotions in detail, you're basically missing a lot of like a larger picture, and your contact center is not going to run as efficiently it should.
So I try and keep it really simple. I run a really large contact center, and when an agent or a supervisor used to come to me and say, I've got an angry customer on the telephone, I'd have to say, how useful is that information? What do you mean by angry? Are they angry enough that they're going to leave us as a customer? Are they going to sue us? Are they just going to annoy you for 5 minutes? How angry is angry? And so if you're managing a contact center, you may not want granular details as to whether or not 25% of your customers are feeling underwhelmed by things, but you want to know how many of them are actively angry. You want to know how many of them are actively happy.
Mm.
We do a lot of things in boxes, and people spend a huge amount of money doing surveys. But actually, you want to know some pretty basic things. Is something going to change the customer's relationship with me? Is number one, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And so, what I'd say is that there's a huge amount of hype in the industry, a huge amount of hype around technologies, and a huge amount of confusion about all of this stuff. But keep it simple.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it very simple. What do you really need to know about a customer? Now, I'd love to know every customer's story and every single thing, but X million phone calls for an organization, it's just not practical. It's not feasible. But the very least I should know is a customer either okay with us, in which case they may not want to talk to us, and we should respect that. Are they happy with us or slightly annoyed with us, or are they annoyed enough with us that we need to do something? And if they are, that's where we've got to focus. It's that simple. Keep it simple. Always.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That really makes sense. And if I have to go to the, again, probably a tangent, right, to this whole discussion that we have been doing, is keeping in mind the whole sentiment analysis part that we have just talked about, the emotions for the customer. How do you define the state of CX in today's contact center setup? If you can give me a sense of the current present scenario, and from there on we can build on top of the rest of the discussion.
Well, I think that generalizing is a little bit challenging at the moment because there are very different things going on in very different markets.
Okay.
So if I talk about the UK and Europe right now, the biggest challenges that people have are agent attrition, are extremely long call waiting times. Queuing is a massive issue. We've seen a tripling of complaints, according to Google Trends, over the last year or so, about length of time in queue on social media. And so I think the biggest challenge in CX in Europe is probably about two things. Number one, it's about delivering service. In other words, getting people to answer the phone at the right times, because post-COVID, what's your new business model? Is everybody back in the office? Are some people hybrid? People still haven't got a handle on that. And then the other thing that people don't really have a handle on at the moment is dealing with their customers who perhaps have been emotionally scarred as a result of COVID and the pressures that we all felt at that time, and behavior has changed. So I think that there is an element of that. But if you're asking me what I think of CX overall at the moment, and I'd say that I'm sorry, but I think we are losing our way a little bit. Customer experience is getting worse and not better. And I'm going to give you a couple of stories in relation to that. So number one, I recently moved house, and when I moved house, my own bank, after some terrible delays and some terrible security decisions they made that they couldn't reverse in a reasonable period of time, had I been moving on the day that I completed the house, I would have been stuck in a van over the weekend because the bank was closed and no one could confirm that I'd actually paid the money, which I find crazy, having stuck all the money in the bank. And then when I followed up with them, they told me that the idea of answering the call in 3 minutes was their current target. Now, I am one of the fathers of this industry, and we set out to set up an industry where you answered the phone in 3 rings, not 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
that we've got a real issue from that point of view. I think culturally around the world, and I'm seeing this in the Far East, I'm seeing it in the Middle East, I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing it in the US and in Europe. I
Mm-hmm.
think that we're struggling to understand what delivering customer experience is. But there's a second real driver, and this is the most interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time in history, we have new technology that changes the fundamental nature of contact center. And this really boils down into three parts. The first one is omni-channel. So whether or not I'm talking to you via chat or through an agent via voice, whatever it is, I want a single version of the truth. I want you to have a single view of me, and I want you to react to my email at the same pace that you react to my telephone conversation.
Yeah.
And that technology is there now, and we can do it. But I'm seeing a lot of organizations struggling with how to bring this to life in a cohesive way.
Mm-hmm.
The second piece is that artificial intelligence has now moved at such a rate that I can now analyze the emotions, the sentiments of a customer at a level of granularity that didn't exist 3 years ago.
Right.
And that this is the new world. And again, do I think people are comfortable with what's possible, that they understand it? I don't even think the people who've invented the technology understand it as well as they might. But it's a brave new world. And of course, there will be winners and losers, with those who adapt and get the hang of this stuff quickly, being the winners, in the way that in Formula One, the first one to work out how to get the fastest car dominates the season.
Makes sense.
And that's where we are. We've got a completely new generation of technology that allows us to understand customers in a way that never existed before. And I think that's exciting and scary for everyone.
Sure. You talked about a very interesting point here, Morris. It was more about omni-channel, right, that you spoke.
Yes.
Increasingly, I feel more and more contact centers are adopting omni-channel way of conversation, right? Because customers' habits are changing. At the end of the day, customer is not only calling you now; they're trying to reach out to you via chat, via an email. It might be WhatsApp integration, anything else, right? What makes them easier to connect to you, basically. Now, with that idea in mind, if you're saying that omni-channel is going to be probably the first question I should ask you, do you see omni-channel being the larger truth going down the line? And if yes, are the contact centers of today's world really are they really adopting the omni-channel in a way where they're ready for it, or they are still to make a lot of changes in your experience to make sure that the omni-channel experience of a customer is really good? Handling one channel might be easier, but then handling 3 or 4 channels and delivering the consistent experience on over all of them, how difficult do you think this is going to be?
So let me answer this one in a couple of parts. So the first part is it going to be omni-channel? Well, the short answer is, financially, yes, of course it will. Because if I phone you and I have a 5-minute conversation in which you tell me you don't have my letter in front of you, then at some point I'm going to phone back. So, one conversation, once done, however you want to express it, first call resolution, etc. All of these things are expressed in the ability to look at all of the information about a customer and to use it.
Yeah.
So that piece is irrefutable financial common sense. And I see that as being the step forward. Now, the challenge that organizations have is that most contact center organizations work with suppliers, and those suppliers tend to want to sell the things that they've got to sell, not necessarily the solutions that customers want to buy. And what I've seen over the last 10 years is that call center operators and their suppliers kind of live in a world where call center customers ask the wrong questions of their suppliers, and the suppliers provide the wrong answers, and as a result, they never quite get there. Now, how does this apply to this? The answer is it possible to put all of the information about a customer into a single CRM? And the answer is, of course, yes. So why is it all done as separate systems is more a cultural and a silo issue, where digital marketing had previously owned the chat channel because it's associated with the website, whereas the reality is that there is a single customer experience in the same way that there's a single employee experience. And those two things are irrefutable. Those two things are the core of what you're trying to do. So if you're still working in your silos where perhaps operations have one system, a classic example of this is one person in an organization might call a customer a prospect, another will call them an existing case because they've got a problem, someone will call them a customer, someone will call them a VIP. If we don't bring all of this information together in one place, we're just wasting our money and we're wasting our time, as well as giving a bad experience, and of course giving a bad experience to the agent. So I think that in technical terms, it's quite simple to bring together all of the information into one platform. It's about a decision being made. And I see this often, and I've done this for organizations where effectively what we've done is we've shortcut all of the technology issues by delivering 5 or 6 disparate systems into a view in a single browser. We didn't connect the systems together. We merely split out the information requests to go to disparate platforms, so the agent got a single view rather than trying to fix the underlying problems. And I think that organizations have the ability to do this now, but they've yet to not enough of them have yet got the will and the understanding as to how they get beyond this siloed, walled environment where you don't know what's gone on in another department, or email has a 3-day SLA and a chat has a 30-minute SLA when someone in voice is talking in a different way.
Correct. I was about to come to this point, right, that you just mentioned. These different platforms in omnichannel, they create different experiences for the customer. Right now, keeping a track of the whole customer sentiment part across all these different channels is like a different problem in itself. It's like a different challenge altogether, right?
Yes.
How do you suggest people should look at understanding customer sentiments across an omni-channel scenario? If they're running an omni-channel scenario, how should they keep track of the whole customer sentiment part, and then how should they be able to act upon it for the betterment?
So there's 2 pieces around that. And we need to talk about the difference between simple sentiment analysis and enhanced or advanced sentiment analysis. And we will talk about that in a sentence. But I go back to what I said earlier on, and this is ultimately emotion is quite simple, really. Someone's either happy or they're not. We're either doing something well or they're not. Someone is going to be okay waiting 3 days to get an answer, or they're not. And it is about having a single view, not having a view based on silo. So, if you think back to how we ended up with different SLAs for different platforms, that's because we looked at the platforms, not at the experience. Email has always been a slow thing, so we've always done it slowly, and we've put a slow SLA around it. But everybody in a contact center knows that you can't tell someone to phone back in 3 days. That's not how it works. So this is about a very slow journey that we've been on towards a single SLA across all channels. And that will come, and that's going to come over the next couple of years. Now, there are elements of emotion that are not common to all platforms. So, for instance, if I have a problem and it's to do with a risk to my personal life, it's to do with a financial risk of more than a certain amount, it's to do with something to do with the emotions of my family, it's to do with a prized possession or my home, it's to do with my mobile phone or something like that. There's an entire group of circumstances where the emotional value becomes high enough that I want to talk to a human. I want to talk to a human because I don't trust systems. And this is not rocket science. We know this from behavioral engineering science for the past 30, 40 years. So under those circumstances, the most important thing is to get them through to an agent as quickly as possible. And then the second most important thing is to make sure the agent's got all the information. Because an agent on their own can go there, or calm down, or we're going to solve it for you. But an empowered agent with the information can turn a negative situation into a long-term client.
Okay.
And that's the piece that we always try and get in the holy grail, is to turn a bad situation into a good one. And that's where emotional analysis, that's where sentiment analysis really comes into its fore. Because what I want to know, what I want to know when the customer phones me is, do I have a highly emotional customer on the phone or not? And if I've got a highly emotional customer on the phone, then I have both the information necessary to help me to calm the customer down as quickly as possible, but also I have the opportunity to turn them into an advocate. And that's tremendously powerful, because a real advocate, and I'm not talking about someone who simply says, yes, I would recommend you on a survey because they can't be bothered to say the truth or because it's just the quickest thing to type. I'm talking about a real advocate has actual value to an organization. And we want to turn every customer into our next customer, especially as we look at a global economic time of uncertainty.
Makes sense. You also spoke about talking, in detail about the difference between normal sentiment analysis and an enhanced one, right? How do you term that out to our audience?
Sure. So sentiment analysis comes out of what used to be known as speech analysis. And speech analysis is really listening to a telephone call and transcribing it as best as possible, and then counting the words without any kind of intellect. And that is great to an extent, but I like examples, so let me give you one. If my mum, who is in her 80s, should say to me something is sick, I know that I may have to drive across the United Kingdom and go and be a good son. But if my daughter, who's in her 20s, should send me a note saying something's sick, I know that what she means that is something ultimately very, very cool. And so the old world of sentiment analysis, of counting up words and trying to aspire a value to them, it took us somewhere, but it's not the same. Now, in the modern world, where conversation analysis looks at what is spoken and what is not spoken, suddenly you have context. So that means that our understanding of sentiment includes not just the words that are said, but we can identify confusion, we can identify sarcasm, we can identify whether someone really means what they're saying. So I remember a situation where, I don't know if many of your listeners are parents like me and with daughters perhaps, and ever been stuck in a car and having an endless row, and finally coming to a point and saying to your daughter, are we okay with this? And my youngest daughter, in one of the frostiest tones I've ever experienced, has gone, yes, I'm absolutely happy, Daddy. Now, The old world sentiment analysis would have gone, whoa, happy customer. The new world of sentiment analysis, because it's got context, because it's got the tone of voice, because it's listening to the pace, suddenly understands that this is sarcasm. And I just want to give you one really practical example of this. The difference between this and old sentiment analysis or original sentiment analysis, it was the best it could be at the time, is that I can, based on constantly the system analyzing more and more insights, I can pick up that 0.7 of a second delay in a conversation means a 90% chance that someone's about to say no, or that by changing one little phrase from will you to would you be willing, you've got a 63% chance of improving the outcome of a conversation. And that's where modern sentiment analysis is a step up in terms of what it's capable of doing.
So I think that's really interesting, Morris, that you have how you have explained this all, right? What you're essentially saying is that it's not only about the words used on calls or on the conversations. What you should be looking at, the context as well in which it has been spoken, right? Is it truly that's something that it reflects from word perspective, or is it a sarcasm or something else that you should be looking at, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have you come across some tools, like technical tools, right, who can identify this advanced sentiment analysis that you are talking about in your implementation?
Oh, so at this point, I've got to be a little bit careful because I work for one of the companies now who actually do this, and I'm not here. I'm not here to pitch. I'm here as an expert.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few companies now who do this. What it is that over the last 10 years, artificial intelligence has got smarter, but also it's become more accessible to experts. So the kind of technology that I'm talking about is both, the kind of application I'm talking about is both an enhancement in the technology that's come about. So anyone can play with this stuff and anyone can use it. But also it's come from the fact that an entire generation of behavioral scientists have had access to artificial intelligence for 10 years. So there are a number of platforms out there. I work with one that does this, and I'm going to say, of course, is the most advanced one in the world, and I'm sure that the other guys would say the same thing. But that's not really my point. Genuinely, it's not my point. We're coming to a new generation of technology. It doesn't just listen to the words, it listens to the breathing. It understands what's being said in the sentences. One of the things I used to do manually was I would listen for a thing called overtalk. Okay. Overtalk is when I say something, like you've just said there, you said something as while I was talking. And that's what I call positive overtalk. You're agreeing with me in a conversation, but the opposite is also true. Yeah. You start to tell someone, what we're going to do is we're going to take you to court, and then, no, you're blah, 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 and that's negative overtalk.
No.
Now, when you've got the ability to analyze all of those kind of clues, the breathing, the pace at which it was said, the volume, the speed, the nuance of the delivery, whether or not it was overtalk, whether it was staccato, whether someone was screaming, whether all of these elements, suddenly you've got a real insight into sentiment. Because one of the things that wasn't true in the old world is true now, is that I used to say for many, many years, why is it that organizations know less about the emotions of their customers than a 6-year-old child sitting in a cafe? We can tell who's angry in the cafe, we can tell who's happy and content and not interested, but walk into a boardroom and ask them how their customers are,
Mm-hmm.
And now we have that technology. And yes, of course, I'm going to say my one's the best one. But, this generation of technology is
Mm-hmm.
more powerful, capable of processing literally a factor of data that wasn't possible before. And
Makes sense.
I remember when the smallest amount of data that I could sell in 1982 was 32 kilobytes of data, and that
Yeah.
cost £360,000. My current mobile phone has goodness knows how much, how many megabytes of memory, how many terabytes of storage. Where as we move forward and processing power is getting better and better, more and more platforms are out there in the market. Now, the only other thing I would say, and this is not me selling, but this is me being realistic, all of the large organizations in the marketplace all say they do absolutely everything. And it's my experience that all large organizations do one thing well. Now, whatever that one thing is, whether or not it's call queuing, whether or not it's the data, whether or not it's one thing, they will have made their bones in that. They will have, that's their thing. But then what they do is they try and buy everything else and they build it into a single proposition. And no one's the best at everything. And so it's very important. If I could just give your audience one piece of really important advice, is you've got to go beyond the hype. All of your suppliers will say they can all do everything.
Yeah.
I've been in this industry for 30-something years, 39 years, nearly 40 years now. No one can do everything. Not even me.
Makes sense. No, makes sense. One thing that I want to ask you, right? From here, let's say we have this all modern way of figuring out customer sentiment, customer emotions, right? The enhanced emotions and enhanced sentiment that you talked about. But at least I feel is just knowing the status quo isn't the final answer. You actually have to get change in the behavior. Like, you have to get the behavior change within the agents to drive the final outcome, right? Or the final customer experience that you really want to do. So my question here would be, Morris, is how do you suggest after having, let's say, a technical system deploying all of this, getting a lot of understanding on what the customer sentiments today are in a very detailed way, modern way, basically, how do they implement, or how do contact center setup should implement the whole information so that they can actually drive the business ROI out of this or the customer experience out of this?
So that's a very good question, but it's actually quite a simple answer. So the reality is these modern platforms, I'm not sure this is true of all of them, but I'm going to speak about mine and the ones that I know about.
Yeah, sure.
But the ones like our one, it takes a morning to connect because it's a standard API, it's a standard connector. In terms of how you gain the insights, it's a WYSIWYG environment designed for end users. There's this term that you may have heard of, your audience may have heard of, no-code programming. And so the idea that I can sit down with a platform without any real knowledge at all and just start to find my way around it. So for instance, in my world, I can look at all of the phone calls that had negative emotion getting worse. So if I want to, I can simply click on one button and say, let me show me all the calls that have got worse. All right. Not only that, but I can then go down, and I can go down to the point where I can hear a particular phrase in a particular conversation. And I can then go up and say, okay, how many times has this been said? And I go back to what I said earlier about the difference between will you and would you be willing. And what you're able to do in the modern world without learning code, and this is the important part, without learning code, suddenly your supervisors and managers have the ability to go in and say, oh, look, this phrase works well. These phrases work badly. everybody start training on the things that work. So what I love about my modern world is I'm not benchmarking against some industry standard that's not necessarily relevant. I'm looking at what worked for one agent, and can I make it work for other agents? And that gives us a really powerful continuous improvement program. And that doesn't require any additional coding. It's not about technology, because this is the difference with these modern AI platforms. You literally can sit there and say, oh, I want to find out. Let's look at everybody who seemed confused. Or my favorite one, my personal favorite one is, I want to look at every person who said pardon or what more than once. Because is there some piece of information in there that either I should have put earlier or that I'm not explaining clearly enough? Because if I find one repeated explanation, I know that if I can improve that explanation, I've got a happier customer, I've got a happier agent, I've got less staff attrition, I'm spending less time on the telephone, and all of that gives me better customer emotion outcomes. All of that gives me better staff outcomes. And the great thing is, it gives me better management outcomes because it hits my bottom line and it reduces my cost. People talk about emotions as though it's a soft cost. In 35 years, I've never believed it's a soft cost. It's a hard cost. So I think that what I would say to your audience is this: that these new platforms are intuitive, they're simple to use. You plug them in and they find the information. It's the old world where you have to learn how to build queries, where you have to go on training courses in order to operate. So, for instance, the new company I'm working with, and again, just to be clear, I'm not going to say the name today of that company. It's not published. I'm genuinely being an honest broker here. We do not have training because the platform is that simple. In the same way that if you think about, you remember your first mobile telephone, it came with a huge manual. I've just recently bought myself a new computer from a particular organization, and it didn't even come with any instructions. So from a practical point of view, that's a really good example of how these platforms are changing. You can now go explore on our one. You click on a conversation, you'll see all of the bubbles of everything that was said in that conversation. You can click, you can wander about. It's like a game, and ours is not unique in that at all.
Makes sense. To end this conversation, Morris, the last thing that I would love to understand from you was, any contact center is a huge responsibility, right? Someone managing a contact center is not just managing 100 200 agents out there or the representatives out there. It's about managing expectations of the people or the consumers who are calling you or who are getting in touch with you.
Yes.
And I do understand that learning more and more every day is very, very important. So could you suggest some resources that people can refer to that has really helped you in your journey in contact center setups to be better at the jobs that they're doing in terms of managing the whole setup? Any read, any book that has really helped you personally, that would be great.
I guess I'm going to give you two things. Now, I'm conscious that we're on different continents, and it's good night for you and it's good evening for me. But the two most reliable sources that I have for insights are, there is a publication. It's called Call Center Helper. It's one of the most respected contact center organizations in the world. It started out as a call center paper when I was young. It's been around for most of my working life, and if you want good best practice of what's going on in industry, I'm afraid I don't know of an Indian equivalent of it. But in terms of everything from how to build an Erlang, how to do the old sizing and workforce management equations, through to the latest innovations, I find them to be very good. And then the second organization that I would point you towards is a company called Contact Babel. And Contact Babel is one of the industry reporting organizations who every year interview large numbers of contact center directors and managers around the world and have consistently produced high quality reports. Now, I have always been distrustful of reports. I believe that 92.135% of all equations are made up. And as a result of that, I distrust statistics because I used to be in the statistics business to some extent. But I find that those two organizations have the right balance between a pinch of salt and realism and everything that people say to them.
You
but
mentioned...
in terms of... Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is, but in terms of getting insights into what's good and what's useful and the latest thinking, those two I would personally recommend, and there's little that I would.
So one, you mentioned Contact Babel, and what is the other one?
Yeah.
So that our audience...
It's called Call Center Helper, but it's all one word. And if you type in Call Center Helper, you'll find that it will come up. And I as I say, they are both UK-focused organisations, but I find that I'm going to use a word that's too infrequently used, or rather too often used in the wrong way. But both of these organisations are run by people with integrity who I trust to do a good job and to give us insight.
Got it.
And I've been in the industry a very long time, and there are very few organizations that I would say that about. Not because they're bad people, but because I know that these guys have the academic rigor and do the process, and I've built a trust in what they do over a long period of time.
Makes sense. Understood. This is the final question, Morris. This was the final question. Thank you for answering it in so detail and giving us the name of those channels. I'm very, very sure those are going to be very important for our audience to look into. But it has been a breeze talking to you. I think we spent about 40-45 minutes already. Thank you for so many suggestions and your inputs. And so such an insightful session. Thank you again for joining Convin Conversations with us.
My absolute pleasure, and can I wish your audience the very best over the coming months, and thank you so much for your time today.
Sure. Thanks everyone else. For everyone else in the audience, you know the drill. Like, share and subscribe to Convin Conversations. I will see you soon.